Sunday Sessions, Alan Watts series, Talk with Mrs. Huxley.
Laura, I've been reading your book, This Timeless Moment, with extraordinary fascination. I don't think I've ever read a biography quite like that, because it's not a complete biography, it's the story of the last days, in a way, or the last years of Aldous Huxley. But I can't think of anybody else who has been written about by his widow, and a case where the book was so very largely concerned with the process of death and with a highly intelligent form of dying. There is, as I remember, a story which is supposed to have been told of Goethe, that when he was dying, somebody called, wanted to see him, but the maid answering the door said, "But the master is busy dying." And our culture is one in which death is invariably something swept under the carpet. Mm. We pretend it doesn't really happen. Mm. And therefore there is no realization that dying is an art.
And it's an adventure too, you know. It's maybe, I don't know, but maybe it's the only chance that we have, that one. We don't know.
It is, and I think as you tell the story, you acted as a marvelous high priestess in helping someone through this adventure.
Well, Aldous had done the same thing for his first wife, Maria, you see, and that of course gave me the inspiration. And they spoke very often of the Tibetan Book of the Dead, which I haven't read completely, but I mean, I know the basic assumptions. And I mean, throughout his work, he spoke about this fact of paying attention. You remember in Ireland,
where the microphone yes. Call out here and now, boys. Attention.
You know, I love so much your seminar, your tapes, and that book. It's the best presentation of that book that I could hope to hear.
Yes, I think that was a very great book, Ireland. The problem is that I found giving lectures, if I announce a title for a lecture, and then give a lecture on a different subject, even though it may be a perfectly good lecture, people are somehow discombobulated.
I think you always give a lecture on a different subject, Alan. You always do that.
I can talk about the same thing in ever so many different ways, but the point is, when Aldous put out Island, he put it out in the form of a novel. And people have very fixed ideas of what a novel is supposed to be, and they had identified Aldous to a great extent as a novelist. And then when it so turned out that Island was a sociological blueprint, form of a novel. They said, well, he's really sermonizing with a few entertaining bits added, just because of the novel form.
Yes, I mean, it would have really, I think, been better if he would have written it straight as a manual for living and loving and dying. Because then it wouldn't, the public would not have expected a novel, which apparently, as a novel, it's not at its very best.
No. No, but that's ridiculous. It's quite obvious to anyone who reads it that it wasn't really intended to be a novel.
Well, it's quite obvious to you, Alan. Yeah. No, it's different, you know. And I mean, in conclusion, very few people have read it. And there are so many sequences, there are so many methods which are so practical for here and now. It would be wonderful if we could apply only a few of them. We would all feel better. You know, I have really sort of a crusade against useless suffering. And in that book, there is so much about suffering which is not necessary, it's not creative, it's just nothing. It doesn't bring any enlightenment, any compassion.
Young people are reading this book today. And it's become a inspiration for experiments in forming new kinds of family, new communities, intentional communities. But I heard a story where Aldous was challenged about this book and said, now, did you mean this seriously? And he said, oh, no, it was purely an intellectual exercise.
Did he say that?
Well, he's supposed to have said that, but what do you think about that? You were with him while he was
Well,
writing.
I think exactly the contrary. I don't think it was an intellectual exercise. I mean, he might have said that as a joke,
Yes.
but he really, every sequence in that book, every method, every recipe, if you like to call it that way, is something that most of them, at least, he experimented himself in his own life. And no, it was not an intellectual exercise. The part of the novel, the writing the novel, it was probably an intellectual exercise because he had to fit it.
No, I realize that.
Yes, but
Aldous also once said, when you are with savages, don't fool with them because you will end up in the cooking pot. And therefore, he used to know how to be very perspicacious and tactful about his public relations. But you know, a thing that has often occurred to me is that Aldous Huxley was one of the most highly educated men I ever ran into. When you study the field of his interests, the scope of his interests, especially as revealed in his essays, he knew a great deal about the history of art, an enormous amount about the history of science and technology. He was fond of the theater. He knew about music. He had an encyclopedic mind, and he carried all this with a lovely urbanity, so much so that I think a great many people simply didn't know how to understand him because they weren't well educated enough.
that's right. The frame of reference was enormous. But for instance, I can tell you about music. I am a violinist. I've been trained as a violinist. Has been the major work in my life. And one time he mentioned a concerto, a Viotti concerto, that no one knows except violinists who had to study it, to work the technique and so on. And he knew this Viotti concerto. It was absolutely extraordinary. He knew as much as specialists, really, in their field. And then, of course, he could correlate all of this. And in this utopia, in this island, he wanted to put everything in, all the chemical study, all the progress in pharmacology, and make it into a concrete mysticism.
Well, I think he, along with that, you see, had the difficulty of living in a country where that sort of highly cultured intellectuality is envied, and because it's envied, it's put down. People used to circulate stories, for example, that before going to a party, Aldous would read in the Encyclopedia Britannica everything that it had to say on the letter P, the origins of that. And then he would subtly move the conversation around to where the letter P in some way became important, and then would proceed to be completely encyclopedic upon the subject.
Before going to a party, Aldous only discussed what I was going to wear and how he liked it and this and that.
Well, I think that sort of story expresses the envy and the resentment which people feel for such high culture.
Well, I don't think he was aware of that. Really, he would have been very amused.
I never saw, in all that I knew of him, any kind of awkward self-consciousness about these things. He had a kind of reserve, which is very natural to Englishmen of his upbringing. A lot of people, for example, I had a rather similar upbringing, and a lot of people think that I'm a bit isolated and difficult to reach, when it isn't that at all. It's really consideration for other people, fundamentally, which makes English people reserved. We don't want to, throw ourselves at everyone. And so it's very difficult to transplant yourself to the United States, where that's more or less what you're expected to do.
Yes, and yet with the upbringing, he would live very much in the American way and enjoy it. I said in the book, we were married in a drive-in chapel. Well, now, less English than that and less Italian than that, you can find it. And he enjoyed it, and I enjoyed it very much. And he did all the things that were done in America. He didn't try to transplant his own way of living here.
Yes, but of course there is still a fundamental style of life.
Oh, a style of life, an inner style, yes.
That's an inner style, exactly.
Yes. Oh, yes, very much so. But, he would, if I was not there for lunch or something, he would make his own lunch very well. And this is rather
You mean
more
he
American.
was a good cook?
Oh, yes, he was a very nice cook. He particularly liked to make soups. We had once he even thought of writing a little book about making soups.
Well, I never...
How is your own book going on?
Oh, I tell you, I have abandoned that for the time being because I felt that writing about gourmet cookery at this moment would be like fiddling while Rome burns.
Well, so what are you doing about Rome?
I'm writing a book instead about ethics called The Rules of the Game.
Uh-huh.
And I think that's an extremely important subject
Yes.
for young people.
Oh, yes.
And as you see, in the same way, you could say from a certain point of view that as his life went on, all of Aldous' books became more serious, or I would prefer to say sincere, and concerned with profound matters.
And this is what you're doing.
But you know, critics have tended to say about the later work of Aldous Huxley, which begins with a book called Ends and Means. I remember reading an article by Charles Savage in the Sewanee Review some years ago, discussing the change in his work, and saying that we are really seeing two different sides of the same man. He pointed out that Aldous is at his best when he is destroying, when he is satirizing, when he is poking fun and contempt at various things. And so in all his early satirical novels, he proved himself to be a master of this. Now, said Savage, he shifts to a certain kind of mysticism. But the message of this mysticism is really the same as that of his earlier novels. Namely, that the human world, the world of personality, the world of differentiation, the world of multiplicity of nature, is really fundamentally contemptible, and should all be dissolved in the undifferentiated aesthetic continuum, in the Brahman, in the Ungrund, in the
một mình tôi nhìn mưa rơi chợt thấy bồi hồi thao thức đợi chờ người xưa đến có lẽ người ta chẳng đến rồi ngậm ngùi nhìn cánh phượng vĩ rơi ve ngân dạ khúc thật bùi ngùi hạ chưa kịp đi thu vội tới từ nay ta đã mất nhau rồi duyên hai ta đã hết rồi.
That was when Gerald Hurd was running the coeducational monastery in Trabuco, and they were trying to take the kingdom of heaven by storm.
Đêm buồn lặng lẽ một mình tôi nhìn mưa rơi chợt thấy bồi hồi thao thức đợi chờ người xưa đến có lẽ người ta chẳng đến rồi ngậm ngùi nhìn cánh phượng vĩ rơi ve ngân dạ khúc thật buồn ngùi hạ chưa kịp đi thu vội tới từ đây ta đã mất nhau rồi duyên hai ta đã hết rồi. Đêm buồn lặng lẽ một mình tôi nhìn mưa rơi chợt thấy bồi hồi thao thức đợi chờ người xưa đến có lẽ người ta chẳng đến rồi ngậm ngùi nhìn cánh phượng vĩ rơi ve ngân dạ khúc thật buồn ngùi hạ chưa kịp đi thu vội tới từ đây ta đã mất nhau rồi duyên hai ta đã hết rồi.
And he had, I suppose, disciplined himself to that, or maybe that was why he enjoyed life so much.
Yes.
That was, he was, another thing, I mean, people think sometimes that he was a depressed man. He was hardly ever a depressed man. Very, very seldom. He was preoccupied, but he always tried to do something about this preoccupation, the state of the world and all that.
But I think all writers tend to get moods of preoccupation. You get completely fascinated with writing, and then you may suddenly have to have a meal and you turn up now and eat. You can't get off your mind off the various ideas or themes you're playing with, and your wife is saying to you, what's the matter with you? Are you angry with me? Or something of that kind.
No, that really only happened because when he was writing Island, because of this contrast, the novel and the essay. Otherwise, his writing, yes, it fascinated him, but he was very ready to change the course of his thoughts. But with Island, 2 or 3 times he was like that, and then, of course, when he was ill at the end, because there were so many things still that he wanted to do, and he wondered, how long would he, how long a time would he have, how much energy. There was a period and yes.
It took a long time.
Yes, he wrote it in 2 or 3 periods. He left it sometimes and then went back again.
Để cho số phận tự tìm lấy nhau, mình chẳng tiếc đi theo xu thế, nhưng tại sao vẫn đến này? Chắc là mình đẹp thế này, mọi người cứ nghĩ mình đã có bầu. Tôi mặc kệ đời số mình đây, sống ép ấy mình cũng thấy cũng vui.
Because when everything is fine and nice and everybody is good and happy, it's very difficult to write about it.
Yes, and in the same way, I think that the imagery of paradise in the history of Western art has been artistically inferior to the imagery of hell. If you take, for example, Gustave Doré's illustrations to the Divina Commedia, those for hell and purgatory are fascinating, but the illustrations for the Paradiso are just these streams of angels in white light flying around the sky. They're very uninspiring.
Well, because that's right, but then he should have seen that in different ways. Now there is all kinds of different illustrations because the photography is in your book, the joy of
chắc là mình đẹp thế này, mọi người cứ nghĩ mình đã có bầu. Tôi mặc kệ đời số mình đây, sống ép ấy mình cũng thấy cũng vui. Gọi cần em phải những mùi ghen hơn cay đắng.
Yeah, we had some books. Yes, he was always looking with the enlarged glass, to look at the details of the.
Now, I must, to some extent, attribute the change in his attitude and also in Gerald Heard's attitude to the time when they first encountered LSD. It seems to me that in there was a mild.
Em xinh như một bông hoa, ngát hương lan tỏa thiết tha tháng ngày. Dù xa tình anh vẫn đắm say, như bên nhau mãi vòng tay nồng nàn. Hoa em dù úa hay tàn, nụ hôn anh gửi trên làn môi xinh. Yêu em mãi mãi chung tình, hương hoa vẫn quyện đôi mình với nhau.
I knew all this very little before that. In fact, I only met him a few times. But when I saw him after the experience, which was in Rome, it was this tremendous vitality and this tremendous interest in looking, seeing, experimenting. Of course, he didn't do this experimenting so often as people thought. It was done very, very rarely.
Oh, well, that's the way I think in any intelligent use of this kind of thing. A single experience gives you so much that it takes several months to digest it.
Yes, exactly.
And to go on week after week or worse day after day with this sort of thing is to give yourself mystical indigestion.
Yes, now this had not happened, you see, by the time that all the died was just beginning in 1963. I remember in the last few months or even weeks of his life, he began to hear about abuses. So I think it would be horrifying to see. I wonder what he would have done. So very difficult. He would have done all that he could. And I wonder how much he could have accomplished in preventing this misuse and abuse. And there's
All that kind of thing means the inevitable. In a world where there are no secrets. In other words, because the community of scientists know all about it in order to work. Therefore, there are no secrets, and therefore everything gets broadcast around. And I felt that when Aldous had let the cat out of the bag, with all the perception, and later with Evelyn Hell,
em sinh như một bông hoa ngát hương lan tỏa thiết tha tháng ngày. Dù xa tình anh vẫn đắm say như bên nhau mãi vòng tay nồng nàn. Hoa em dù úa hay tàn, nụ hôn anh gửi trên làn môi xinh, yêu em mãi mãi chung tình. Hương hoa vẫn quyện đôi mình với nhau. Đừng làm cho trái tim đau, đừng làm nỗi nhớ nát lòng tâm can. Tình yêu không đợi thời gian, yêu nhau có lúc lệ tràn đậm mi. Đừng bao giờ nói chia ly.
Wait a second. I was going to Italy and I read it on the plane. No, it came out in 1955.
55, yes, that might be.
No, 54.
54, still.
It was in the summer of 54.
Yeah.
I didn't run into this until 1958.
Oh, I think that we met here in San Francisco one time.
Yes, that's
Giữa
right.
cuộc đời anh chỉ cần có anh, cái nhìn đầu đã độ màu thâm
You got
thiết.
married in 1 year.
Bởi chút duyên anh từ trong sâu thẳm, hay anh giống điều gần gũi trong em. Phút nhẹ lòng anh vui vui tự hỏi, nhưng thấy cần chỉ giải thích rạch ròi. Vì khi tim anh mãi đã có em, và anh cũng nhận lòng anh rồi đó. Yeah, yeah. Em đã tặng anh bài thơ hay nhớ.
And he seemed to be feeling that more and more strongly as time went on.
Yes. I remember he was writing a bit of summer before we were married. He was in New York, and he wrote to me that he went to see a musical comedy, and it was a very cool and vulgar thing. And he said, yes, even there, one would look with attention, look deeply, one could find
hay anh giống điều gần gũi trong em. Phút nghe lòng anh vui vui tự hỏi, nhưng thấy cần chỉ giải thích rạch ròi. Vì khi tim anh mãi đã có em, và anh cũng nhận lòng anh rồi đó. Yeah, yeah. Em đã tặng anh bài thơ hay nhớ.
The little baby calling for its mother in the dark. Coming on like, all this God, Jesus and salvation and everything, and saying it as if they knew all about it, but you could see this was a big front on quaking terms from these.
Well, the same thing is there was nothing that Aldous really was very fine musician, and the musical comedy for him was not his type of music, and particularly this one, I don't know which one, but was particularly bad. And yet,
anh mãi đã có em, và anh cũng nhận lòng anh rồi đó. Yeah, yeah. Em đã tặng anh bài thơ hay nhớ.
The very first time that he had with Maria and Dr. Osmond.
Yeah, yeah.
And then he went up to Hawaii and spoke about it to Krishnaji. And Krishnaji was very familiar with the whole thing. He said, oh yes. He said, oh yes, that's right, that's so. You know? He knew exactly Aldous was speaking about. I have a feeling that Krishnaji is there all the time, except when he has to come back and talk a little bit. And I think that is the merit of Krishnamurti to do this speaking to people, because probably he would have a much better time not to.
Would you say that Aldous was greatly influenced by Krishnaji?
Yes, I would say that he was influenced by Krishnaji probably more than by any other single religious man.
Well, I, in a way, could say the same thing. Only one is always very hesitant in acknowledging any debt to Krishnaji because he so hates the idea of having any disciples.
Yes.
But I, for my part, feel that he is one of the most original and profound thinkers in the world, because he's always a bit unexpected. He's never in the ordinary ruts of a religious or psychotherapeutic thinking.
Well, the trouble is that the trouble is not the trouble. The point is that that is what he is, but he does not give any way to get there, and that is the great thing, you see. People say, well, how am I going to do that? And you know that he really was very, very angry at me when I wrote that book, You Are Not the Target, with recipes of techniques. I thought that I was very innocent, and I told him about it with great pleasure. And, he was quite violent about it.
Oh, you tell that story in your book, though, really, don't you?
Yes, and yes, because I spoke about this during a lunch, and then we were alone, and he looked at me very, very intensely. And he said, all these people that go around helping other people, I think they are a curse. Looking at me. I was so shaken, but after a few seconds, I found myself and I said, what do you think you are doing? And his answer was so delightful. He said, oh, but I don't do it on purpose. And that was something that Aldous just adored, this thing. I don't do it on purpose. It was so clear to Aldous what he meant. But it's not clear to everyone because it's not easy, really.
That was the conversation, wasn't it? That, again, it's reported in your book, where he ends up on this extraordinary note that the state of consciousness that he's trying to describe as in himself is one which has no center.
No center, that's right. And it is just the opposite of what we find. We always try to find the central core of ourselves.
Yes.
And go to the center, find it, be the center. And he said, no center.
Yes, that was very strange.
Very strange. One can feel that for him it's all so natural. For Krishnamurti, all this is so natural, so obvious, that it seems to him preposterous even to have to say these things. But I must say it's not natural and easy for many people that I know. It's not easy for me, certainly.
Did Krishnaji in any way disapprove of Aldous's use of psychedelics to see these things?
Well, this I don't know. He never told me that, and I don't think that he ever said anything like that to Aldous. No, I think the two men were so nice together. I don't know. They didn't speak much. We once visited Krishnaji in India for 3 days, and I don't think that they ever talked very much about all this deep philosophies or modes of existence. They just were very nice together. One felt a tremendous liking for each other. It was a very special atmosphere when they were together. But I don't know that he told him, directly, you shouldn't do this or anything like that.
In other words, when they got together, they didn't discuss deep matters, but just enjoyed themselves.
That's right. As a matter of fact, I must tell you about those 3 days, because we were living in the house of this great mystic, and he had a marvelous cook. And we always looked forward to the next meal. It was the most refined food that you could imagine, without any animal food, completely vegetarian. And the variety of tastes and the delicacy. I mean, the great refinement really of the way that Krishnaji lives. In a way, he could have been, maybe he is an hedonist, you see, because he appreciates all the things of perception.
We say hedonist.
Hedonist.
Yeah.
I remember him once speaking about materials. And everything, his perception are so cleansed, you know, the doors of his perception are very, very clear. And it was marvelous. I was waiting for the next meal.
You see, this is fascinating because this doesn't come out in Krishnamurti's lectures.
No, I know.
Nor does humor come out.
No, and he has a great deal of humor, although he's very, very preoccupied about the world. He was. I haven't seen him lately. He was preoccupied about the world because in the world there's so many churches and priests and psychologists and all that. That was, which probably he equates in a way with politicians and all the rest of it, you know. People that are being followed, that are followers. He has that, but do you think that one can be without leaders? Do you really think so?
Well, I suppose you could argue that the presence of churches and priests and psychologists were like the presence of spots on a person who has chicken pox. Of course, these spots are, in a way, letting off infections inside the body, and therefore they fulfill some sort of function. But they go with a diseased condition. After all, if we were living in harmony with the way of nature, the Tao, as the Chinese call it, we wouldn't need churches and priests and psychotherapists.
I know, but we don't live in the Tao.
No. And but perhaps. Well, I think, you know, this is a bit off the subject, but when you get into a real jam and you realize it's useless to call the psychiatrist, you're undergoing a very creative experience.
Yes, if you go to all the way to the end of it, not if you stop it in the middle.
And you don't call the psychiatrist,
no.
you see.
No.
I have a kind of terror of calling a psychiatrist into any situation because I know what it might lead to. Yes. And so I always try to leave it alone. And I don't want to offend my psychiatric friends by saying this, but I mean, some of them know how to handle things, and some of them, I was just talking to one the other day who wouldn't dream of getting one of his patients into a mental hospital. And
he would not dream.
No, he wouldn't dream of it. He does everything in his power to avoid that sort of a solution or non-solution. Yes. But I think, in a way, this is Krishnaji's attitude to all the people who are trying to help others, is that a lot of people are doing that kind of work to try and help other people. But I know in my own case, I'm not really trying to help the world. And I think that's what Krishnaji is saying when he doesn't do this on purpose. When he says he doesn't do it on purpose. And I think that Aldous had a very similar attitude, that he was writing about mysticism and philosophy and religion, not because he was even writing about the alarming state of the world, but you never felt in him the fanatic.
No.
He was so extraordinarily interested in what was going on that seems to me the primary reason why he wrote.
Oh, yes. Well, that was his life, was his way of living, to write, you know. But I asked Aldous, when Krishnaji told me that, you know, and so violently, I said, what do you think? Should I do this? And he said, no, everything should be done. What Krishnaji does is marvelous, but what you do, giving tools and giving recipes, that is also necessary. I mean, he included everything. He didn't think that, only one thing, that there was only one panacea. That is, of course, was completely different from his way of being. He couldn't have been so restricted. But what did you say just a minute ago about yourself? That you...
Well, I often say, half-jokingly, when I'm asked in a student audience, why do you go around lecturing on these things? I say, because I'm a philosophical entertainer. After all, not all entertainment is frivolous. You do pay entertainment tax when you go to a concert. by a pianist who's going to play Mozart and Beethoven sonatas, you could hardly call that frivolous. And so there can be philosophical entertainment in the same spirit.
Yes. And then also, I mean, everybody has to express himself the best way. And it seems to me you are such a marvelous virtuoso of words, like all these words. Naturally, you must use your virtuosity. It would be bad for you and for everybody else if you wouldn't.
Now, here's the thing that's fascinating. You see, in using words, I've been accused of being a word man.
Well, of course you would. I mean, that is that's beside the point. You can be accused of everything.
Well, of course you can. But you know, people, especially when you get into this whole new domain of emphasis upon the experience, not ideas, not theories, but getting down to the real experience, so the encounter
thao thức đợi chờ người xưa đến, có lẽ người ta chẳng đến rồi, ngậm ngùi nhìn cánh phượng vĩ rơi, ve ngân dạ khúc thật buồn ngùi, hà chưa kịp đi thu vội tới, từ đây ta đã mất nhau rồi, duyên nợ hai ta đã hết rồi.
Not just thinking about how it came about in the expression, but just what your mouth does to pronounce that word. It's the most fascinating thing.
Đêm buồn lặng lẽ, một mình tôi nhìn mưa rơi chợt thấy bồi hồi, thao thức đợi chờ người xưa đến, có lẽ người ta chẳng đến rồi, ngậm ngùi nhìn cánh phượng vĩ rơi, ve ngân dạ khúc thật buồn ngùi, hà chưa kịp đi thu vội tới, từ đây ta đã mất nhau rồi, duyên nợ hai ta đã hết rồi.
It's just like, like a millionaire that can say, well, money is not important because there is so much of it. And you can say it, and others could say it, but for the rest of us, I think that we have to have the appropriate words. I know how difficult it is for me, you see, because words is not my mean of expression. You know, I cannot think. And I know that it's very good to have them. And I believe that I notice very many young people here, they get so much trouble because they don't express themselves right. They say the wrong words, you know. They never had either the thought or the opportunity, I don't know which, you know, but they want to say something not very nice, like say, you know, I would like to go away, I would like not to do this, and they say drop dead. Well, people don't like to hear that.
Thu vội tới, từ đây ta đã mất nhau rồi, duyên nợ hai ta đã hết rồi.
Which I can immediately detect on the telephone.
Yes,
If somebody calls and says, like Mr. Watts, I was just wondering if there's any chance of your being so that I could come and rap with you, you know, and there's a sort of dead voice. And, you know, at once I'm inclined to reject such an encounter.
Well, those are the people that must see you. You must see them. That is a very signal. Because, I mean, you might inspire them to get a little bit more alive. I think there are many people that are not quite alive. Do you find that?
Oh, sure. Zombies.
Yes, but I mean also among the people that have taken drugs and so on, that you expect them to be more here and now. And
yes, but they didn't bring anything to it. You see, that experience with LSD doesn't really do much for anyone who doesn't bring something to it. But if you bring a lot to it, it enlivens all that you have. The people who have the best LSD experiences are those who say before they take it, oh, but I don't need that kind of thing. What you're telling me about is the state of consciousness I'm in all the time. And
yes.
they have the best results with it.
That is very true, but those people sometimes are put in a mental hospital too, because they see too much.
Maybe. Yes, you can see too much.
Well, the impression might be so overwhelming. I mean, I'm getting here in your house, here on the boat, I'm almost getting in that place, because this water and these hills and the light changing, it's so beautiful. Do you work here right on this window now?
No, I do sometimes.
You do sometimes?
No, I usually work where the books are.
Yes, because here it's very inducing to just
well, you
be with
should see
it.
The changing quality of light. When the dawn hits that mountain, Tamalpais, even those Air Force radar domes get transformed, and they look like the domes of a mosque.
I see.
And I feel I'm in some strange oriental world, and the way the house lights up all these houseboats across here, I mean, the sun lights up all these houseboats, they become rich and golden and bejeweled, and people would say, well, this is a dirty old slum, but you should see it at dawn, it's a paradise.
Yes. Well, you see it, and this transformation is really the keynote, isn't it, to our living, to be able to transform.
Yes, well, it's that sentence which Aldous Huxley uses for the doors of perception from Blake.
Oh, yes.
If the doors of perception were cleansed, we should see everything as it is, infinite.
Infinite, yes.
Tell me, what was Aldous' attitude in the whole process of delight in words? I mean, would you feel while he was working on something that he was completely delighted with the whole sort of triumph of being able to get some extremely subtle emotion or some personal attitude in a character that he got just the mot juste, the right word for it?
Yes. Oh, yes. He was delighted in that way, and he was delighted with words of others. You know that he read the poetry aloud. I have a lot of tapes, beautiful tapes, where he read poetry aloud in English and Italian and in French, just for the pleasure of hearing these words back again. Yes. Oh, yes, he had this thing of the word. And then when he helped me writing You Are Not the Target, I would read to him. He had such patience, you just have no idea. I would read to him these recipes. And if he ever changed a paragraph, my editor would reject it somehow. Evidence that it was too good, it was a different style. And so that never went to the book. But one word here and one word there, he would just get that word or a quotation. The quotation was very extraordinary. Yes, well, he had this enjoyment of words, and in the same time, he thought that one should let them go, they are not so important. What did he say? The words are good servants, but bad masters.
Cuộc đời sao lắm phong ba, chữ duyên lần đẫn ép nửa đời tình nghe mãi xa xôi.
He felt himself not to be a very good
Especially in delineating the character of women. It's so easy to make her rather stereotyped. Women when writing is very bad.
I think that's why I like D.H. Lawrence so much.
Lúc đến như trời trốn tìm,
But he could get
thôi đành mặc kệ con tim, để cho số phận tự tìm lấy nhau. Mình chẳng thích đi theo xu thế, nhưng tại sao vẫn để đến nay? Chắc là mình đẹp thế này, mọi người cứ nghĩ mình đây có bồ. Thôi mặc kệ đời số mình đây, sống ngày ấy mình cũng thấy cũng vui. Gọi cần em phải những mùi ghen hơn cay đắng.
In the final stages of this his life, wasn't he, about to begin another novel and had written some of it?
Yes, he wanted to write a sort of autobiography, semi-autobiographical
That's
novel.
what I gathered. Yes, reading as much
Yes.
as he published.
And because he felt that there was so much intermingling, so intermingling his own life with the events of the century. It was so extraordinary what had happened since he was an adolescent or a child.
Chẳng thích đi theo xu thế, nhưng tại sao vẫn né đến nay? Chắc là mình đẹp thế này. Mọi người cứ nghĩ mình đây có bồ tôi mặc kệ đời số mình đây sống mẹ ấy mình cũng thấy cũng vui gọi cần em phải
And now similar ladies of similar dignity and age go around the Corniche or in the highways here at 70 miles an hour. He used that to show how we can really develop our potentialities in so many different ways, in so many different directions. That was one of his constant thoughts, the development of human potentials.
Of course, his lifetime spans the most startling change of the speed of human history that has ever existed. And he simply, his lifetime bridges it.
Yes,
because he's
exactly.
got one foot in the Victorian era and one in the 1960s.
That's right. That's what he wanted to do.
Yes. And I don't think any other people at any time have spanned such enormous change.
And he was so much with it all the time, all these changes in different fields.
Well, the critical period of change, you see, was just before the Second World War. You see, he published, just before the Second World War, because, you see, he published Ends and Means just before he left England, didn't he? That book comes about the same time as Eyeless in Gaza. And that was when he knew Gerald Hurd first. Now,
yes.
What prompted him to move to the United States?
Well, he was traveling, you remember. First of all, he lived in Italy a long time. And then in Italy, the fascist regime came about. And Gerald Hurd moved to America. And somehow this whole group of Englishmen moved here. And then he was here naturally for his eyesight. He found a teacher that helped him a great deal in overcoming this blindness. And they climbed, and then they went to live in the desert. But I think that Gerald Hurd was quite did give the incentive to move here and leave Europe.
So it was primarily just his interest in Gerald Hurd and the group around him.
Yes, and then what was happening in Italy and in Germany and so on that made him. And in England he couldn't live because of the climate. He would get the bronchitis just like that.
Oh, really?
Yes.
That's interesting. I couldn't live in England because I couldn't make a living.
Well, he lived there, remember when he was a critic on some newspaper as a young man, but he never really wanted to live there. As soon as he could, he moved into Italy, and then in France, and then he always went back. He liked to go there for a month or two every year.
Well, I do the same thing, but
em xinh như một bông hoa ngát hương lan tỏa thiết tha tháng ngày. Dù xa tình anh vẫn đắm say như bên nhau mãi vòng tay nồng nàn. Hoa em dù úa hay tàn, nụ hôn anh gửi trên làn môi xinh. Yêu em mãi mãi chung tình, hương hoa vẫn cuộn đôi mình với nhau. Đừng làm cho trái tim đau, đừng làm nỗi nhớ nát nhau tâm can. Tình yêu không đợi thời gian, yêu nhau có lúc lệ tràn đậm mi.
He went up had a touch of TB. I think that they thought that she might have TB, and then they went up there and they liked the desert, and they lived in the desert for several years, and then it became too difficult to live there, and they came up in the Fandom.
Well, I was expecting in a way.
Em xinh như một bông hoa, ngát hương lan tỏa thiết tha tháng ngày. Dù xa, tình anh vẫn đắm say như bên nhau mãi vòng tay nồng nàn. Hoa em dù úa hay tàn, nụ hôn anh gửi trên làn môi xinh. Yêu em mãi mãi chung tình, hương hoa vẫn quyện đôi mình với nhau. Đừng làm cho trái tim đau, đừng làm đôi nhớ nát nhau tâm can. Tình yêu không đợi thời gian, yêu nhau có lúc lệ tràn đậm mi, đừng bao giờ nói chia ly.
Feeling is the
Em xinh như một bông hoa, ngát hương lan tỏa thiết tha tháng ngày. Dù xa, tình anh vẫn đắm say như bên nhau mãi vòng tay nồng nàn. Hoa em dù úa hay tàn, nụ hôn anh gửi trên làn môi xinh. Yêu em mãi mãi chung tình, hương hoa vẫn quyện đôi mình với nhau. Đừng làm cho trái tim đau, đừng làm đôi nhớ nát nhau tâm can. Tình yêu không đợi thời gian, yêu nhau có lúc lệ tràn đậm mi. Đừng bao giờ nói chia ly.
Kind of natural life, and yet if you wanted to go to the university or to go to New York, it's so simple and so easy. It's a very convenient place to live from any point of view.
Well, again, you know, those Europeans don't pay for lectures.
Yes, again, yes, oh yes, surely.
The economy of an author. Now, it's a very curious thing about Aldous Huxley, because when I first knew him, he couldn't lecture for love or money.
Well, that's...
He used to put his nose in a manuscript and mumble.
Goodness, I never seen him do.
But this is something you must be responsible for.
No,
because after he married you, he turned into a fantastic lecturer.
Fantastic lecture, but I don't know that I was connected in any way with that, but he was a fantastic lecturer. And
but it's incredible.
It's incredible.
Because what happened was that right when I first was out in California, let's see, this was in 1951. At that time, Felix Green arranged for him to give a lecture at a high school auditorium in Palo Alto. And he was still in the mumbling stage. Mm-hmm. Then, after Maria's death, he married you. I went down to Santa Barbara, and there was a concert being given in which Stravinsky was interested of Gesualdo's madrigals.
That's right.
And in the intermission, he gave an extremely amusing talk.
Yes, and he loved it. I mean, he really enjoyed doing that.
Well, now, what had happened was that always he had been a fantastic conversationalist.
Yes.
Even though he was apt to sort of take over the conversation, nevertheless, he was invariably fascinating. And he used to fill his conversation with the most amazing anecdotes. He was particularly fond of kind of horrendous happenings and details. You remember that time we were talking about when we had lunch at the Tokyo Sukiyaki restaurant? There were four of us sitting at the table, and all the neighboring tables stopped talking.
Listening, because
and they listened in because he was talking about subliminal advertising.
Yes, oh, that really impressed him. How you could look at President Eisenhower, but it really was Marilyn Monroe underneath.
Yes,
so everybody
exactly. So you associated the beautiful girl with General Eisenhower or with somebody's toothpaste.
Yes.
And he was going on and enlarging on the horrendous possibilities of this. And I remember him once, the conversation going on in great length about the appalling nature of fashion in medicine.
Oh, yes.
So that you would never really know
what
at the present time whether it was as ephemeral as an operation he once described where they removed the long intestine.
The long intestine, yes.
And he said it completely disappeared. Nobody ever had such an operation. He said the only trouble about it was people used to have to go to the bathroom like birds.
Every 20 minutes.
Every 20 minutes.
Yes.
But then you see he started to get the idea of lecturing in just exactly the same tone of voice and spirit as he carried on ordinary conversation.
It was absolutely like a conversation. I never saw
And
it.
suddenly he got released from the manuscript.
Yes, and, well, he said to me, well, I just decided that what I was saying was really not so important after all, you know. The world it was not going to be changed by my lecturing. And so it was, I mean, I've been with him, you know, before the lecture, and usually before someone goes on the stage, there is all kind of little ritual and things. He never had anything like that.
No, all that's a nuisance.
Yes, all that's a nuisance.
Yes.
He just would be at dinner with other people and then walk out on the stage.
Yes.
He would go sometimes and mumble, and somebody's here, may I go to the men's room before he goes? That was all that he asked.
No, well, it was a very strange transformation, especially for somebody at that time of life.
Yes, but he was changing all the time. I mean, after the fire, you know, we went to live with this friend of ours.
When the house was burned down.
Yes. We went to live with this friend of ours who has 2 children and 2 little children, and it's a completely different ambience, you know, when there are 2 children. He never seemed to mind or to make an effort or to exercise patience. And one does need patience, you know, for children. But it was a natural thing for him, I guess, or maybe a training thing, to take things as they came, moment by moment, without sort of referring to old experiences. I think that he had probably more than anyone else this paradox, you see, where he had this terrific amount of information and memory, and then it was freed of emotional conditioning from the past.
How so?
Well, because the emotion of the past did not interfere with his present. In other words, he responded to the present with new reaction. I mean, he reacted to the present with fresh reaction and not with a conditioned reaction from the past.
Do you think he was in some respect helped by that, by the fire? After all, his past, all the records of his past practically were wiped out.
Everything, yes. No, I don't think that the fire did that for him. I think more his meditation and his work with psychedelic and his constant vigilance in that sense. He was really very, very aware that should be stopped, you know, that one should stop this reacting to the present in terms of the past.
Yes.
That was very much in his consciousness all the time.
Well, of course, that's central to Krishnamurti's whole presentation, yes. But that fire, I had a friend who underwent the same sort of experience, where she had luckily built herself a new, smaller house, and just after she'd moved into it, she'd kept a lot of records in the old house, and it was burned down. And there were all these souvenirs and letters and photographs and paintings and books, which are suddenly wiped out, and they're ordinarily things you cling on to and you feel you really can't do without that, and then suddenly it all goes.
Oh yes, we had really several tongues of this thing. That's where we went.
But he did rescue, didn't he, the manuscript of Ireland?
Yes, he rescued Ireland and the 3 best suits, the suits that we had made in Italy.
And 3 suits?
Yes. He said, don't you think we should take some suits? I was in a completely useless state because the fire had so fascinated me that I was just looking at the fire all the time, and I would not even have thought of that. And all of a sudden he said, oh, I must take Ireland. So he went upstairs and took Ireland. And then he said, shouldn't we take some suits? So I said, yes, let's take some.
But did he sort of risk his life doing this?
No, because our house was not in fire yet, but all around.
Oh, I see. The fire was approaching at the
time. Yes,
it was
approach. Oh, yes, I saw it approach. I saw it approach from the garden. In fact, the walls were illuminated so beautifully. You have no idea. It was just the right illumination. And I was looking so much that I would not even take in the suit, you see.
Well, that's certainly not reacting to the present in terms of the past.
No, that's right. We was past. I was just not reacting at all. It was just so beautiful, you know.
Yes, it's so fascinating how in moments of crisis we do tend to become much saner than we are normally.
Well, maybe that was sane, I don't know.
I mean, people accomplish the most, we can become geniuses in crisis.
But I didn't accomplish anything, you see. I just looked.
Well, I know, but you were contemplative instead of an active.
Yes, exactly the contrary of my nature. Absolutely the contrary. I'm very active. And there it was, this fire all around. But who said that the fire, I remember Aldo saying in his lecture on visionary experience, that, is it Plotinus, that says that the fire is the most beautiful thing in the world.
Yes.
In connection with precious jewel, you know, which contains the fire.
Christians still worship fire because for many people the most important time in a church service is watching the final extinction of the candles after the service is over, and they'll all wait on their knees until that's been done.
Yes, it's like seeing the sun going down.
Yes,
moment,
watching the sunset. Yes. Are there any materials of Aldous left over which will, see the light of publication?
Well, the letters. Oh, that is going to be a marvelous volume, yes. It's coming out next year. It's coming out next year, and there are letters since the age of 14 to the last days, you see. And there are really, it's a marvelous biography. There you see all the passage in this man's life.
So he wrote a great deal of letters. Was this true all through his life? Was it true after you got married?